Welcome, dear listeners, to another bone-chilling episode of Unveiling Nightmares. I'm your host, C.A. Bainham, and today we have a special guest with us. Our guest today is none other than Sidney Shiv, author of Fall Equinox. So welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for being here. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am an American author living in England. I've written one collection, Where Demons Dine. I've been in a few anthologies.
Yeah.
And I've just published an anthology that you just mentioned called Fall Equinox for Halloween.
Great. And that was released this month, wasn't it, if I remember correctly?
It was. Yeah, it was written, just released, I think, last week at the very end of September.
Okay, that's wonderful. And how's that going for you?
It's going good so far.
Brilliant. That's wonderful.
People that are reading it seem to be enjoying it.
Great. So what inspired you to write in the horror genre?
I've just always been drawn to horror, even from a young age. I think my earliest memories of getting into horror, I can remember seeing like the Universal monster movies like Frankenstein and Dracula, and I think what really changed it for me at an early age was I think the Hammer films, especially Dracula. I was always into Dracula when I was young.
Yeah.
And then that kind of segued into reading Stephen King at an early age. And, from the time I was a kid in the 80s, in my elementary school, we had Stephen King books, which, we wouldn't have those in elementary schools in the States nowadays. But I remember I guess, the librarians didn't really know or care as much about what was in them. But we had all of Stephen King's books, probably up to and including it, in my elementary school library. And I remember checking out a movie tie-in version of Cat's Eye from my elementary school library. So, and all of the, Stephen King's movies were becoming popular back then. And that and horror movies, before we had social media, when I was a kid, we would just talk about, the movies that we weren't allowed to see, but one of us did see. And, so things like Jayson and Freddy kind of became, almost like, urban legends to all of us kids who, hadn't seen them yet, and really, we wanted to, and then eventually we would, but, so just kind of the word of mouth on the school playground about all this, horror type of stuff that, all of us kids were into at the time.
Yeah, I think things were a lot more relaxed back then, weren't they, to what they are now?
Yeah, it seems that way. I mean, I don't know if I would want it being on elementary school shelf for my daughter to read, she's in middle school now. I don't think I'd want her to read it quite yet, though I was, I don't know. It's a different mindset we have now, as parents. My parents never censored what I read. They wouldn't let me watch certain movies, but they never censored what I read. So I was reading very adult stuff at an early age. But now, now that the shoe's on the other foot, I don't want my daughter reading it. She's almost 13. And that's still one that I would cringe at her reading certain parts. If I let her read other Stephen King stuff, just fine. But yeah, there's some books I would just be like, I'd prefer you not to read those, maybe until you're a little older.
Yeah, I agree there. So can you tell us about the first horror story that you ever wrote?
Oh, I don't know if I even remember the first one I ever wrote. I've been writing in one way or another my whole life. I from an early age, I've always loved telling stories, and I also did a lot of screenwriting when I was younger and made short films.
Yeah.
The first story I had published was a couple years ago in the Books of Horror Anthology 3, was a story called Fishhook Fingers. That was the first story I've ever had published, and it's in that anthology, and it's also in my collection.
Yeah. Great. So how do you come up with the dark settings in your stories?
The dark settings are really just based on places I live. A lot of times they're just basically just my hometown, the county I'm from, and then the different, and the city that I'm from. I just take certain aspects of it, and I've created a fictional place where pretty much all of my stuff so far has taken place.
Yeah.
And it's just very closely based on where I'm from.
Right. Okay. So what horror authors have influenced your work the most?
Probably first and foremost would definitely be Stephen King. I've just been reading him my whole life. Yeah. And then later on, some of the earlier splatterpunk stuff like Jack Ketchum and Edward Lee I've been reading for years and years. I'd say even still Edward Lee is just a huge influence on the way I write.
Yeah, I hear a lot about Edward Lee. He seems to influence a lot of people.
Yeah, he has a great, his prose is excellent, and he just has the way of writing the just some of the sickest stuff in his books, but he writes characters that are relatable, and he writes characters that are somehow relatable, yet also a lot of them have really disgusting quirks, and then just things happen in the books that are just so bizarre and so sickening, but then he manages to weave in just these really deep, philosophical discussions. So he's one that I find real fun to read.
Yeah. Okay, so what's the most challenging aspect of writing horror for you?
Oh, for me, the most challenging aspect is just completing stories. My brain is very all over the place. So I kind of, I used to have a problem of being able to finish stories. I'm very good at starting them, but not necessarily good at finishing them. So eventually I just, decided, okay, well, if I start a story and then my brain decides to start telling another story, I'll do that. And then I've noticed that eventually my brain will cycle back, and, eventually, I may have 10 or 20 stories started and nothing finished, but then there'll be a period of time where I'm finishing everything.
Yeah.
And I may have a week where, I'm finishing like 5 stories, and but then there'll be months and months where there's, nothing. It seems like nothing's getting finished. So I've kind of learned to just, if I'm having writer's block with one thing, to either start another thing, or I like to do editing, and I like to do artwork. So yeah. I'll just switch gears and focus on something else if I'm having trouble writing.
Yeah, I saw in your new book that you've got out just, you've done your own artwork in there. You've illustrated it yourself.
Yeah, I did that, and that was really fun to do, to create illustrations for other people's stories. I hope, in my collection, I'm just illustrating for myself and not too worried about it. Now it's like, doing illustrations for other people's artwork. I'm hoping, my biggest fear is like, when they see the finished book, are they going to like the artwork that they did for it, or approve of the way I edited their story, so it's almost more nerve-wracking turning the work back over to the other authors who are in it than it is to just open it up to the public to read.
Yeah. I can imagine it is. It's like having other authors sort of like criticize your work, isn't it, really?
Right. So, yeah, I just like to get to the point in people reading the work that I put out, either my own, or if I decide to do more anthologies or collaborations, I just like to have enough people reading it that people start to criticize it, really.
Yeah. Do you ever scare yourself with some of the things that you write?
Not really. I hope it scares other people, but I don't know. I feel like sometimes it comes out of me so slowly that it doesn't startle me enough to be scared. It scares my wife, the little bit of my stuff that she's dared to read. She doesn't like horror at all, so she doesn't really read much of what I write. But I'm definitely, I definitely allow myself to be scared by other people's work,
Yeah.
And that's another thing too, when we hear about people being, you hear people say, "Oh, well, I've never been scared by a book, or this or that." And I feel like, well, you got to allow yourself and put yourself in the mindset to be scared by a book, and you gotta, set the tone for yourself. You can't just come at a book, like it has something to prove to you.
Yeah.
You have to be open to it.
You got to kind of lose yourself within the pages, haven't you, as you read each page?
Right. Almost the way people, drink wine, which I don't know how people go about being connoisseurs of wine, but they know how to taste it, and they can, draw from it what they will, and I feel like if you go into reading a book, you've got to judge the book for what it is rather than what you expect it to be.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so how has the horror genre evolved for you, do you reckon? And have you got an opinion of where you see it's going to go?
Wow. As far as where it's going to go, within the like extreme splatterpunk communities, there's a lot of it, a lot of it right now is really the gross out type of stuff, and that's all good. And I love the gross out type of stuff, but I also, want there to be substance to it. And I want there to be, if there is going to be gross out, I want there to be a point to it. And so I hope it kind of harkens back to, stuff like Jack Ketchum and Edward Lee and kind of the OG splatterpunks, where they're telling a story first and foremost, and the violence and gore are justified byproducts of a decent story.
Yeah, that has been sort of like something that has been mentioned quite a lot, hasn't it, just recently, that splatterpunk is just about the gore and not the plot. But when you actually read some of the books, you actually see that, there is a plot to it. It's not what everybody thinks it is.
I agree with that. And one I just read one yesterday that I read in one sitting called Them by Mackey Watson. I hope I pronounced his name correctly, but that book was the whole package. It actually kind of sent shivers down my spine, and it's hard to get that as a reader from books, and a lot of people talk about Stolen Tongues and the opening chapter of that book, and I read that book, and I agree. It's chilling, and I like to see more of that in the splatterpunk stuff. And so when I do, it's very exciting, because it's like, we have a book that's horrifically violent and gory, and it just makes you cringe at how violent it is, but then it also has a plot and a story that sends shivers down your spine, because it's actually scary.
Yeah, I have seen some really good reviews about the book Them. seen it. It's been popping up on my news feed quite a lot just lately.
Yeah, it's a fun one.
So, how important is the research phase to your books?
Oh, it depends on the individual story. And right now, I'm at the point where all I've written is short stories. I'm trying to, I have some novella ideas, and hopefully they'll come to fruition soon. But right now, it's with the short stories. It kind of just depends on if there's something within the short story that needs researching. And yeah, if it's something like one of my stories, I talk a lot about possums, and so I had to do a lot of research on possums just to make sure that the things I was saying was accurate. But I think research is important. If you're not 100% sure about something, look it up. Especially we see a lot of people talking about guns and stuff that aren't familiar with them, and then they say the wrong thing, and it makes people always want to point out a gun doesn't do this or that, and just as an example. But so you just always want to make sure you know what you're talking about. I mean, there's always going to be times where we slip up and put something in there that's not 100% right, but if it's at all avoidable, make sure you know what you're talking about before you write it in a book.
Yeah, you're right. There's always going to be that one person that picks it out for you.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So any rituals that you like to do before you get yourself motivated to writing?
No, I wish I did. It sounds like fun, but no, I don't. I really, for me, it's just a struggle sometimes just sitting down and getting started. So I mostly I do my stuff in the morning, and once I get going, I'm good. But it's just forcing myself to sit down and get going is my issue.
Okay, and are there any memorable reactions from readers that stand out to you?
The author Brian Boyer, who's written a lot of really great stuff. I just kind of discovered his stuff this past year, and he writes just some really fast-paced, exciting stuff. I admire his writing. He read my collection, and he read the first story, which is a piece of flash fiction. It's only about 1,000 words long, and it's about the end of life on the planet, and he said it was one of the sickest stories he's ever read, I think, to quote him. And that was awesome. That made my day.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that would be a really good review to get from another author, especially one that you admire.
Right. Yeah. I don't think he said it in the review. He messaged that to me just so people don't go and look it up and be like, oh, he's lying about that. No, he messaged that statement to me after he read it, but he did write a review that he liked the book, and that was very nice.
That's fantastic. Okay, so have you got any upcoming projects?
Let me think. Upcoming projects. I have one thing, probably about a novelette length project, which I've had done for a while, and I've just been kind of struggling with what to do with it. Whether I want to kind of write a few more and release it as a collection, or if I want to try and put it on Godless as an exclusive. And that's what I think I'm going to do. I think I'm going to release it on Godless, and it's a novelette length piece called Fulfillment. And it's basically about a bunch of kind of celestial creatures in the afterlife who work at a fulfillment center and are trying to find meaning and purpose in their lives.
Yeah. Sounds really good.
So it's kind of more of a it's definitely horror, but it's definitely got more of a comedic angle to it.
Yeah. So have you got any advice to give to aspirating, sorry, I do apologize, to aspiring horror writers?
Oh, that's I feel like I feel like I am still aspiring. So I'm still looking for all the advice I can get, but the most important thing I would say is just, don't give up on a project if you get stuck. Just set it aside and do something else for a bit, and then eventually, my issue was, if I didn't finish a story, a lot of times I would throw them away, or they'd get lost and forgotten about. Yeah. Now, they stick around on my computer, and I kind of cycle back to them, and eventually they get done. So just don't give up if you have writer's block, or the ideas aren't coming quick enough.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when you get a story, you can sort of like visualize the first beginning of it, then get stuck in the middle, and then you can visualize the end of it. So you sort of like have to take a seat back and then try and go back to it, don't you?
And that's exactly, I can almost visualize an entire story in my head, but getting it out in writing is another ball game.
Yeah, it can be really hard, can't it? Trying to get it out onto the paper.
Right. That's the struggle.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a right pleasure to have you on the show.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure being here, and thanks for having me.
You're very welcome, and thank you for accepting to come on the show. Stay tuned, dear listeners, for more spine-tingling tales and dark discussions in a world of extreme horror. Until next time, remember the nightmares are real, and here on Unveiling Nightmares, we're crafting nightmares one tale at a time.